Hello and welcome to our series in dialogue with China. This is the third of a series of events this semester, and there are 3 more such events planned for the fall. China looms increasingly larger on the horizon, but do we know enough about it? That is the question which we are trying to explore. Our first event meant to address the problem of the political status of China right now, democracy in China, and it proved to be an event that was suitably problematic and difficult to arrange. Our main speaker was to be Professor Zhiji Wei from Hong Kong University. We had planned this event for 3 or 4 years already, and first the pandemic intervened, and then the national security law intervened, and unfortunately he did not manage to come here. Last week's event was a conversation between David Ownby from the University of Montreal and Karma Hinton from
her last position was George Mason
University, now retired. And there we talked about the question of the media and what they give us. And David Ownby talked about the need to see the diversity of viewpoints available in intellectual life in China, and Karma Hinton talked about the various ways in which our perception of China is colored by the political conditions in our own country. Today's speakers come from Europe and Harvard. Professor Siep Stuurman is an emeritus professor in history from the University of Utrecht. He is well known for his work on the idea of humanity, which came out in 2017, published by Harvard University Press. And our second speaker today, our second conversant, I should say, today is Professor Wai-yee, 1879 professor of Chinese literature at Harvard University. She is a specialist on the Chinese historian Sima Qian. Our 2 moderators today are Michael Nyland, our own Michael Nyland, and Professor Luke Habberstad from the University of Oregon. Thank you.
Yes. Professor Stuurman, will you do self-presentation?
Yes, now we can begin. Can you all understand me clearly? Fine. Let me begin with a few words about how I became interested in China, and in particular in Chinese intellectual history. Some 17 years ago, having finished a book about a 17th century French feminist Cartesian, François Poulain-Labarre, but I not speak about him today. But the title of the book I published about him is significant. It was François Poulain-Labarre and the Invention of Modern Equality. By modern equality, I mean the universal equality that first surfaced in the European Enlightenment, and that is equality of all people qua people. In the Diderot's Encyclopedia, Louis de Jaucourt writes that natural equality is the equality that people have and enjoy in virtue of their being human, nothing more and nothing less. In practice, it turned out otherwise, of course, but I'm not going to that. And then I embarked on the project of writing a long-term history of ideas of equality. For most textbook of political theory, as you probably know, are centered on liberty. Equality comes from time to time, but if you look in the index, always liberty has far more mentions than equality. So I was planning to set that right. But on the other hand, I say the problem was, what kind of equality do you mean? What type of equality do you, because then it's everywhere: economic equality, social equality, cultural equality, and the list goes on. And I didn't do that because that would be a history of everything. It's attractive subject, but you don't do it. So in that time, after 9/11, with the Muslim question in Europe, I said that the relationship between cultural difference and equality, that was the focus I would take. But if you take that focus, you focus also on cultural difference and how it relates to equality, then you cannot do a Eurocentric thing. You must get out of the straitjacket of the canon of the history of political philosophy as it is taught in many European universities and also in American ones. So, and you must also counter another tradition that looks at inequality and othering with a capital O. People who talk about other people are othering them. You cannot othering with an object. We other the Chinese, and the Chinese other us. And the name connected with that is, and the book connected with that is a man whose book I very much admire, namely Edward Said. But Edward Said has stimulated the focus on othering. And I thought that the other side of the question, people can also see other people as fellow human beings and also can engage with other culture. And Herodotus says at the moment, ancient Greece, the Egyptians call all people who don't speak Egyptian barbarians. The Egyptians look at us as us, the Greeks look at the Egyptians. I call that the anthropological term. Now, China had to be in this project because China is, apart from Europe, the most intellectual powerhouse, and it is an autonomous intellectual tradition that for a long time remained autonomous. Well, the Jesuits brought in European astronomy, and there were misconceived attempts to reconcile Christianity with Confucianism. In the end, not much came out of that. But the strong European influence in China, just as in Japan, came after disastrous military encounters with the European empires. So how to do that? I began reading. The first thing I read was, of course, the Analects of Confucius, a far more accessible text than I had expected. It is down to earth. Confucius, at a certain moment, he said, "I've never met a man who loved sex less than virtue." That is not what I expected from a highfalutin philosopher. And then I read Mencius, because Mencius is the second great Confucian sage, and Mencius makes sort of a social and political systematic theory out of Confucianism. And Mencius has a lot to say, more than Confucius, about barbarians. I use the word barbarians with the scarecrow brackets around it, but I cannot pronounce the brackets. But I don't mean barbarians, I mean others. The Greek term barbarian, of course, was from the beginning ambivalent, because Herodotus says at the beginning of his history, say, well, in this history, I will discuss Greeks, the marvelous deeds done by Greeks and non-Greeks, Greeks and barbarians. So the barbarians stand on the same level as the Greeks there. It is not the language of a nationalist hack. So that's why I began. And that is why I became interested in China. And it is a project in, let's say, a new subdiscipline of intellectual history, which is today called global intellectual history. Because in intellectual history, you had the same situation where for years and years, or for decades and decades, the first textbook of political philosophy is by certain Charles Blakey in Britain in the 1840s. He was close to the Chartist movement, and he dedicated the book to the King of Belgium, because Belgium was at that time the most democratic constitution in the world. But it was a Eurocentric project which knew where it went. It went to the liberal democracies of Europe. But if you will take other cultures into such a project, you must, let's say, see how you're going to do that. So one of the things I did, and was more or less by accident, I was reading about China and the barbarians. And I came across a book by Nicolas de Cosmo, and what is about that subject. And he quotes some of Sima Chen's lines about the Xiongnu, the nomads north of the Great Wall. And I said to myself, I've seen this before. That's just like what Herodotus says about them. So that was my subject. A couple of years later, I was at the School of Historical Studies in the Institute for Advanced Study, and there Nicolas Cosmo was a professor of East Asian history. And I asked him, Nicolas, can you tell me that there are such interesting parallels between Sima Qian and Herodotus about the steppe peoples? Herodotus wrote about the steppe peoples in what is today Ukraine, or was. Is there an interesting comparative article about that? It was his specialism. If there was, he should know it. He said, no, there isn't. Well, then you can do two things. You can say remorse to pity, or you can write a missing article yourself. I took the second option. So that was how I became interested. And that's for now probably enough. But I await questions from everybody, and I will be glad to take them. And at the end, I want to say something to the organizers of this meeting. Thank you so much for inviting me to this interesting and timely meeting. And on top of that, I'm immensely happy. I'm in a real time, in a real place, with a real audience consisting of real people. That is something new that we must have more of that. Thank you.
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. And how did I come to be here talking about this topic? It's not with such a grand artifice as humanity. I would say that I come to this because some years ago I was chatting with my friend Chow, and we were talking about a book called Friends and Strangers. That led to thoughts about the subject, and so I wrote it. And I would just share some of the thoughts in those essays related to the topic that we brought up. One is the question of common origins, which you see also in this handout. This is something that Townsend developed systematically in projects. Basically, everybody's related according to the people have shown you shared ancestors with us. Sample lineage and then is traceable to the Yellow Emperor. This is an argument that you see a lot in warring states. I won't go into details, but each individual case is interesting, why they do so, and what is the implicit argument about it. So just to give you an example, the state of Wu, for example, is supposed to be descended from, as some of you know, from the. Oh, I forgot that.
Okay, sorry about that. So the state of Wu is supposed to be descended. The rulers are supposed to be descendants of the brother of someone who eventually became the ancestor of the Zhou king, and the Wu is in the far south, and they're supposed to have gone there and cut off their hair and tattoo their body, 断发纹身, in order to show that they are not fit for ruling in the central state, so that this nephew of theirs could eventually become the Zhou king. So the argument behind that is that the very beginning of culture depends on the barbarian. It depends on the barbarian stepping aside as the enabling act that allows this Zhou foundation to happen. So each story is interesting. We don't have time to go over all the stories. I would just say a couple of things. So a certain common origins does not have to mean amity. So in the Zhuozhuan, for example, this text from about 4th century BC, there's a passage by the king of Chu, basically fantasizing about how he can demand ritual vassals from the Zhou court because in the distant past they're related. So in other words, it can facilitate all kinds of unreasonable demands, like Ukraine is ours kind of demand, just because you're related. Also a certain difference does not have to mean conflict. So in one speech, again, from the same text, there's a character called Zhu Zhi, who is the ruler of the Jiangrong. So this speech is dated to about mid-6th century BCE. And And in that speech, he basically said that we, the barbarians, are not related to you, so we can have peaceful coexistence. We don't have to answer your unreasonable demands and so on. We don't need to be in conflict precisely because we are not related. So by the same token, all the birds and bees argument that you see a lot in historical texts can be used to support opposite policy positions. It can support war, of course, because they're birds and bees, right? Or it can support peace because they're birds and bees. So we should focus on something else, like cultivating our nearer neighbors and so on. So I would say throughout, we see in this argument of who's a friend, who's a stranger, you see a lot of fluid boundaries and frequent redefinition as to who is the barbarian and who is not the barbarian. And these are arguments maybe based on lineage, geography, customs, principles, and so on. And a lot of the arguments, whether it is an argument about radical difference or an argument about common grounds, depends very much on the specific rhetorical context and specific policy recommendations, whether we, as I said, war or peace, choice of partners in an alliance, or even taxation, you know. So in other words, people abstract those arguments and say that this is what the Chinese in X period think about who's the barbarian. But if you look at the context, you will see that is often much more complicated. And even that argument that is often cited by monks about 用下变移, that you use the Chinese to transform the barbarians, and that he has not heard about 变于夷, that being transformed by the barbarians. So that is often cited, for example. But the context of that argument is basically monks is scolding someone who has turned to a person from a southern state and advocating some sort of radical egalitarian principles. So it is an argument about that set of teachings rather than who's Chinese, who's barbarians, just as an example. And because of this fluid boundary and constant redefinition of what is civilization and what is barbarity, the in-between figures are very interesting. The envoy, the spy, the women in these kind of marriage alliances, the abducted women like Cai Yan or Cai Wenji, all these characters, their alliances and how they are written about in the tradition give us thought to think about this topic. So one of my favorite examples, and I didn't write about that because I'm not a 13th century expert, is Hao Jing, this Yuan dynasty poet and scholar official, 13th century. So he started out being a subject of the Jurchen Jin dynasty in the north. Eventually, he served the Mongol Yuan court. At the time, there was still a quote unquote Han Chinese court down south, right, in the Nansong, in the southern Song. So he was sent as an envoy to southern Song and was detained there for 16 years. And he wrote a lot of poems about it, comparing himself to Su Wu. So Su Wu is this Han dynasty envoy detained in the courts of the Sonu, not being allowed to go home. And he, as a representative of the Mongols, being made captive by the Han Chinese, compared himself to Su Wu is really interesting, right? Because in his reckoning, Su Wu, in his reckoning, the Yuan court is the real China now because they have legitimacy. And you know, it's like in the 18th and in the 17th and 18th century, when the Japanese wrote this Wai-yee biantai, they were arguing that the Qing court is not, China is no longer Chinese. We are the real Chinese now because we are the upholders of the civilization and all. So this, you know, all these boundaries are very interesting, I think. So just one more thing, I think I'm about out of time. The anthropological turn that Professor Stuurman talked about in his handout, I think that too, of course, you see in Sima Chen, and I think the speech that Zhong Hangyue is quoted in the handout, so you can see for yourself, basically someone who is defending Xiongnu customs to the Han envoy. And so I would just say that this type of anthropological turn is linked to historical self-consciousness, meaning the very notion that you're actually writing history is linked to that anthropological turn, not only because of the idea of actually observing something and writing about it and trying to tell the truth as best as you can know it, but also because this particular move involves a kind of critical self-consciousness, a kind of critical self-reflection on the state of your civilization. So in that particular case, of course, it was about Zhong Hengyue criticizing Han imperialist expansionism. In earlier texts, in Warring States texts, you find this argument voiced by some wise barbarians, and those arguments have also to do with thinking about the state of civilization, such as revolved around questions such as whether you should have too much refinement, how much culture is too much culture, whether simplicity would not be better for everybody, or whether we can break away with tradition, or whether we have to follow tradition. Can we, wear trousers, for example, and make us better archers? So that's adopt this Hu customs and have mounted archery and so on. So that is a specific event you're arguing about, but it turned into broader thoughts on how much allegiance do we owe to tradition, how much we're allowed to change it. So that type of critical self-reflection is what I'm thinking about. So ultimately, this sense of distinctions and a very neat picture of how who is at the center and who's at the margins, the kind of things you see from about the 1st, 2nd century BC onwards, this kind of concentric squares, the court at the center, and increasing degree of barbarization as you move outside that is very much a function of empire. But even after that, there is a lot of discussion of that. But the systematization and the moralization is a function of unification and empire. And even then, there's a lot of questioning of this. So I would say that, among the questions that I would still like to think more about, there are two of them. One is, so you often hear this argument that people make that in the Chinese case, when we talk about Chinese and barbarians, we're not talking about ethnicity, we're not talking about customs so much, we're talking about moral principles and who has the ritual, who has the Lineage, and so on and so forth. And then it all sounds very grand, as if we're very grandly inclusive because we're really thinking about high principles. But how to define this Lineage, or is it really just a particular version of ritual and propriety? So this apparent tolerance behind it can also be a little bit absolutist. So for example, Han Yu in Yuan Dao talks about, this is Han Yu is 9th century. Han Yu is 9th century. So Han Yu talks about how in the spring and autumn annuals, when Chinese ruler behaves in a barbarian manner, that 诸侯用以礼则夷之, right? Then they have to be treated as barbarians. 夷礼尽于中国则中国之. But when the barbarians adopt the principles of the central states, and they should be treated as the central states. And you think of this, wow, this is really tolerant and broad-minded. But that essay is a tirade against Buddhism, right? So it is this doubleness of what does it mean that we're so high-minded, we think only about moral principles, that first of all. And secondly, because it started out with me and Eileen thinking about friends and strangers, I also think about friendship a lot in this context, and who is a friend. And also because Siep's book, wonderful book, has so much on equality and the discourse of equality. And I think the discourse of friendship is really one big source of the thinking about equality in the tradition. So in one of the excavator texts, Yu Cong, that you even have this definition of 有君臣之道也. The way of friendship is the way of ruler and subject. So in other words, friendship is that which introduces equality and reciprocity in hierarchical relationships. And it is one way for you to erase difference. So I don't think it kind of comes to the barbarian question, but it's another question that I like to think about. So in a volume that I'm editing, there's an essay by our friend, another Princeton friend, Miriam Epstein. So her essay is about this 19th century 谈词 by this women writer Zheng Zhenhua and Meng Yingyuan. So in this 谈词, this woman dreams about or writes about or actually, I haven't read that Townsend. I read excerpts of it, but basically, she only does. So the book is not only about her female friends; it's about how she treats her other relationship as friendships. Her relationship with her father, with her with the man she knows, and other types of relationships. So what happened in a society that turns relationships into friendships, and what sort of yeah. Anyway, so I thought that's very interesting. So I thank you. I'll stop now.
Yes, there are now so many topics on the table that I'm wondering where we begin. And maybe I'm going to begin with a book by Hans Luke, whose introduction I was reading with students yesterday. And he was talking about how we diagnose historical situations, and they have to be fairly precise historical situations, to see where an essential equality is even on the table or not on the table. I'm mangling that. But one reason we're all here is because friendship is one way one sees essential equality. But another way is simply going to another country or reporting on another country and seeing those people as equal, though different. So I think I'd like to start you off with, if people have an essential equality in specific cultures, how do you see those essential equalities, and how do they relate to the cultures that you're reporting on? Siep, could you begin?
Yeah.
You might want to get
Oh no, the green light is on.
Okay, good.
Yeah, that's a question that has concerned me for a long time, because all-round equality is a limiting concept. It doesn't exist in historical reality. But what exists in historical reality, and I always begin, is the critique of existing inequalities. And let me give an example of how that works in the European Enlightenment. The example is a famous one, this Montesquieu, and the subject is slavery. Now, when Montesquieu was writing his Esprit de Loi, one of the most influential textbooks of political theory in the second half of the 18th century, he had beside him the whole piles of notes and annotations which he consulted. And in the notes and annotations, of course, edited as a book by the industrious French. And so we have that. And I've looked up slavery, there's also an index. And in the notes, he says, well, slavery is against natural law, against humanity. And then comes the explosive sentence, the war waged by Spartacus, that's the uprising of slaves in the Roman Empire, was the most just war in human history. But that explosive sentence didn't make it to the published version of the Esprit de Loi. So here you see self-limit, an author, he thinks, well, can I say this? Well, in my notes I can say this, but in the published book, I don't want to go so far. Somewhat later in the 18th century, Diderot and the Abbé Raynal, the Histoire des Deux Indes, the first book gives a grand picture of European expansion. There's a lot of critique of European colonialism, and they say, they applaud, they say, well, the Negroes have already founded in autonomous regions, that's the Marronage in the Caribbean, and they already have fought for their liberty. And when Europe doesn't listen to them, then more will ensue, and they will overthrow the odious system of slavery by armed with terrible weapons. And after the black coat, we will get a white coat. And this, the story says, this passage was read by an educated slave on one of the plantations on Haiti, and that man was Toussaint Louverture. So there you have a link, but we are not sure that we have no written source that proves that Toussaint Louverture read his ideas before he started the uprising, or that he afterwards inserted that in the story, and that will never be known. But that are the ambiguities that also always are bound up with the question of equality and inequality. And remember that nowadays, when I would say that the rule of men over women is natural, I would get some right-wing extremists at my side and some religious fanatics, but no more than that. If I would say there are essential difference between the races and the white race is more intelligent than the other races, the same would happen. But if I say in economics, equality is natural and productive and must be perpetuated, then I would not. Then I would have very, very many people on my side. Nowadays, neoliberal economics is precisely the doctrine of inequality that hastens inequality more and more. That's what Piketty has shown us. Now, I guess you can do the same with text from antiquity, but I have taken a few examples that equality is not a question of all or nothing. And also, interestingly, there was a time when the anthropological turn, but that is part of equality thinking, that you put yourselves in the footsteps of another. What would it be like to be a working class poor man? What would it be a man can? What would it be like to be a woman? That's a very difficult thing to do. But there has been a time, and I learned that from the German Egyptologist Jan Assmann, who writes about the Egyptians of the early and middle, the ancient, the old and middle kingdom, that the Egyptians, talking about people with which they had treaties, kept talking about these people as vile enemies. The Egyptians could not conceive of an ordered world outside of Egypt. So the anthropological term, and we witness in very many historians in antiquity, both in Greek antiquity and in Roman antiquity, was already an accomplishment. They wrote about others as others, but that they were interested in the structure of the otherness, that was an enormous step forward. I don't believe in progress in the large sense, but this particular step, I consider progress. Not moral, perhaps, but intellectual.
For me, that brings up a question about reading publics. Wai-yee, you were talking about tradition, but one of the things I'm struck with in my work is there are many traditions, and people are negotiating between different visions of what their culture consists of and where they exist in this. Would you like to talk to that?
I don't know that I have an answer to that. You mean who is reading what, or who is?
Well, I think depending on who is reading what or whom they're citing, all of this, we would get a very different picture of, for example, who is someone we would call Chinese.
You know, I mean, if we're talking about the repertoire, the kind of authors that we read, they don't raise that as a question about themselves, right? Whether they are Chinese.
Yes.
The question becomes interesting when it is who's not one of us, and when you know, so like all these writings about the Jesuits, whether they are one of us or they're just these what they're called Taixi Zhiru, all these Confucian scholars from way far west, right? But to me, the more interesting question is when unexpected candidates claim the mantle of being Chinese, when being Chinese mean some other things, when some other project. So that maybe that's not answering your question, because I actually think of a lot of the people I read as reading very much the same things, you know, because the culture has a kind of homogeneity until the 19th century. I think they read a lot of Confucian
I would
texts.
absolutely
They read a
disagree
lot of
with you.
canonical poetry and
I would disagree with you on that. Yes, we often have disagreements. I think that when you say that, I think of Nicholas Standart's work, where he shows that people aren't reading the classics anymore by Ming or Qing. They're reading digests. They're reading the equivalent of Cliff's Notes because there's too much to know, too much to read. But in my period, and maybe it's because it's the early empires and they don't have a strong sense of what are we supposed to be doing here, I think they're still working it out. And you can see that in the Shiji and Hanshu, that they're going, well, should the classics take precedent, or should the statutes take precedent, or should local custom take precedent? And they're still debating all of these things. So I don't, of course, for example, Bangu clearly was a classicist extraordinaire, but he doesn't identify himself as a classicist. He would put himself in the literary category for writing those fu. And he says there are 12 kinds of people who need to serve the court. And the classicists are only one of them. And he criticizes them more than he identifies with them.
I'm happy to be corrected on that.
Yeah.
I don't have any stake in that question. It's just that sometimes when I read these people, whether it's the Ming and Qing people earlier, they all seem to know so much more than what I know.
Yes, that I would agree.
It seems like they've read everything. I don't know how they do it, but they seem to know everything.
That I would agree with. You know, they know far more than we're ever gonna know, including books we don't have access to. Yeah. So then we get back to how did they reconcile quite different pictures of how life should be lived and how one exists in society. No sense.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I guess, you know, maybe everyone has their set of texts and follow their thinking. But if you, oh, sorry,
Forgot to turn this on. If you think about the question you asked Siep earlier about equality, and if we follow his answer, meaning equality is not something one achieves, but as something that one aspires to, or maybe put differently, why does one even aspire to it? How does it exist as an ideal? It exists as an ideal because of the belief that we can be better, right? So maybe that's the common ground with what Mengzi said, 人皆可以为尧舜, right? Anybody can become Yao and Shun so long as you follow 孝悌之道. And maybe yes, maybe not, but so long as there's the idea that we can all be better if we, you know.
Yes, so you prompted me to think of what it means to become a fully developed human being, Changren. To be whole and intact is such a strong value in this society. Yeah.
But there's another side to this. It's also,
Have you got-
the light is on.
Okay,
I'll
good.
speak louder. There's another side to this. When people look at equality and aspire to equality, they get a different look at the people who are placed higher in the hierarchy in the society they live in. These were looked up to, and now they are demoted to people who are perhaps not so virtuous, not so moral, and can even be reconfigured as enemies.
Yes.
And that happens from time to time. And also you can ask, what does it mean that people become equal in a certain sense? And the quote I have from Chen An in the Tang Dynasty in my handout, someone was born in the Center Lands, but whose behavior does violence to the Li and the Yi, is Chinese in appearance, but barbarian in his mind. someone who was born in barbarian regions, but whose behavior conforms to the Li and Di, is barbarian in appearance, but Chinese in his mind. What is happening here? For the barbarians in the old sense, the ethnic barbarians residing somewhere else, not in China, not born in China, is the price of become equal to become more like the people who are already equal, namely the Chinese, because Chinese standards are still on top, but Chinese standards are no longer equalized or identified with Chinese ethnic individuals who are born in China. And this happens all through history, that the price of being equal is to become more like the people who are already equal. And in present day debates, this is the difference between assimilation and integration. It is an assimilatory concept. And it is very difficult to move beyond assimilatory concepts, because if you look at the people who now immigrate into Europe, or have immigrated in the past 30 or 40 years, they want to become equals in the sense of participating in European society. That means the Europeans, or some Europeans, tell them that you must also in other respects become like us. For example, in the religious aspect. So you must, that we respect you on the condition that you, that stupid religion of yours, abjure. And this is a polite version of what really happens.
Yes. I have one more question, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience. I think a lot of this brings up in my mind something to which I have no answer. But I wonder if our sense of selves are not impoverished in the modern era. For me, it comes down mainly to my gender, my nationality, my profession. And I see so many people that I'm reading about that have more complex senses of how they are connected in the socio-political sphere. Are we living in an impoverished age where diversity is harder than it used to be because we only have a couple of markers that we can agree upon our worth identifying with? Luke, what do you think?
So your question, oh, was this on? Yeah. Is diversity more difficult now because we only are aware of?
Somehow we've got our 6 cultural markers, for example, and I think of this with the anthropological turn, and you go, what are cultural markers?
Right.
Your food, your language, your nationality, your very few cultural markers. Whereas what I'm reading in my texts, and many of the people we're talking about, Sima Chen and Hanyu and Su Shi and others, had a far richer set of identities.
Well, I also wonder, I actually might think it's the opposite, although this is completely not my field and I'm being speculative, but sometimes I think diversity might be more difficult today because we are simply inundated with so much information and through technology of all different kinds, of so many different kinds of differences, that it in fact becomes overwhelming for people to process all of that. And so there must be an ordering of difference, or signposts must be created in order for people to simply process all of the information that's out there.
So I think what I'm hearing, and just let me push you on that, is because today, in theory, we can pick and choose our identities when there's this much information out there about what might be desirable and not.
In theory.
Something, yeah.
I just want to say, I'm done with identity. I think it's the most boring thing in the world.
I agree.
I mean, I think fine, race, gender, class, it's all fine, but there's so many other ways to think about the world. Yeah.
Yes, but so then pursue that. And I too, I'm done with identity.
I think one thing
authenticity.
that identity does And authenticity too, it can become a very parochial argument. So, you know, think about Frederick Douglass. The book that inspires him is the Columbia Orator, other, you know, speeches of Washington, Jefferson, and these imaginary speeches, maybe parliamentary speeches. I haven't actually read the book. I saw it with, I mean, the book Columbia Orator, I saw it referred to. But I mean, if Frederick Douglass were in school now, he would be asked to read, you know, look for the roots of African-American thinking and somehow define his vision according to who he is and where he's coming from. But the world is available for us. We're allowed to get anything we want. I don't know. Yeah. So
In a small part of the world.
yes, of course, it's a privilege that we can get what we want, but we shouldn't turn lineage or culture or ethnicity into an expectation that this is somehow your sphere, that if which I will not do. Let's say if I all of a sudden take a novelistic turn, do I have to write about what it means to come to America as a foreigner or whatever? That may be the least interesting thing about me, you know. Anyway, I
Please.
But we necessarily, as academics, self-identify as people who ask these kind of questions. That is what we are. And there's no going back. People think long ago there was real tradition. Everybody believed that in a real tradition, the concept tradition doesn't exist. But once the concept tradition is up-taught, then tradition becomes an option. That is precisely the idea.
But to think about another example, like Chu Jin, this revolutionary who was killed in 1907. So when he wrote poetry, his motto was 杜甫 and 陆游. He doesn't have to think that, oh, because I'm a woman, I have to think about the tradition of women's poetry. All that I'm saying is that there is a way of thinking about all this subset of traditions as somehow defining a person or to which one has to hold allegiance is just limiting. We don't have to think that way at all.
Could I just follow up? Actually,
Yes.
I wanted to hear.
I think
Oh.
he wants to say
No,
something.
no.
Oh, sorry.
uh,
Okay. On the you mentioned lineage just now, and you mentioned it in your lecture, how lineage was a central project for Sima Qian in terms of thinking about commonality, you know, because he makes the Zhongnu part of the same lineage as the Chinese, and so that's in the toolbox in China. And I wanted to hear Siep talk about that a little bit, and whether lineage or that kind of lineage family discourse figures in the story that you're telling in your book in any way as part of the story of the creation of this idea of equality, or is that a kind of distinctively Chinese thing in your
No,
your book?
lineage is not this distinct Chinese thing. Lineage is, you have people who have a lineage. These are people who have, let's say, nobles in European history. They have a lineage, enormously important to them. Nowadays, they talk about it over and over again. There are also people who have not so much lineage. The Western woman, yeah, her mother was probably also a Western woman, and that is tradition, but it's not a lineage. Lineage comes with power, and power is unequally divided in society.
Well, so that's what makes Sima Qian so interesting, is he seems to be using lineage as a way to create commonality and linkages rather than
Yeah.
I'm better than you.
No, but lineage can also be that you belong to a certain people. That is descent. We call that descent. Lineage I associate with family networks.
Mhm.
But if you think about the whole Adam and Eve story,
We're all part of the human family. Yeah.
Well, you can see where that happens.
Right.
common.
Right.
Yes, throwing it out, please. Tim, you were first, I believe. Yeah, and then
First, so
very hard to
So-
know who people are.
yeah, so I
behind
speak with
masks, so-
absolutely no expertise here, but I did have just a comment going back to what Wai-yee said about Frederick Douglass. It's not only Washington and Benjamin Franklin that Frederick Douglass reads, it's Cicero and Demosthenes. I mean, it goes all the way back to classics, which in the Columbian Orator, which is, I taught that tech class fall. My question is just for everybody, which is to return to the question of friendship. as a kind of topic. I mean, again, the only thing I really know about this is having worked a little bit on Matteo Ricci in the 16th century, who goes to China and writes a book about friendship. And is friendship a useful concept for thinking about how we can move across these kinds of differences? And is there a break between what we would think of as Western friendship or friendship that would be articulated in the text that you're talking about? How would we think about friendship? Is friendship something that we can think about universally or not?
I guess I would say for the first time ever in a history of China course, where we don't have many weeks to get through more than 2,000 years, I devoted an entire lecture to friendship. Because I think there are so many institutions we can't understand. And friendship, many modern Chinese would say friendship, well, that's transactional, that's guanxi. And friendship in the early texts is absolutely not that. Friends are the people that you are close enough that they can help you develop and mature. They can criticize you and you listen to them in a way you would not listen to anyone else. And so the traditional tale told from late imperial China on is that friendship is the least important of the 5 relations. The others are hierarchical and either kinship based or quasi kinship based. But in fact, in many of the early texts, the acme of socio-political relations is having someone there whom you trust enough that when they criticize you, you can hear that criticism and you can move along together. So there's a famous phrase in Chinese, and then I'll shut up, called he er bu tong. To be truly harmonious, you cannot be the same. You must find someone who will help you develop in a positive way, or otherwise you never become a fully mature person.
I want to, I'm sorry. I just want to add to that. I really think friendship is so interesting because it is a mechanism of correction in the tradition. It is what corrects inequality and hierarchy, because so Mengzi said, Yao Shen, what is Yao Shen? Is the case of the son of heaven making friends with a commoner. So the whole discourse of abdication about how in the very high equity, there's ideal politics where people are ready to yield their power. And that is based on friendship, a sense of common cause with another person. So if one thing it is missing, however, is of course it's supposed to be a male thing. It's less on there's less on female friendship. That's also true in other traditions, I think, because women don't leave the home, right? But you can have it in other guises. Think of the story of Ruth and Naomi. So they may be mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but they act like friends. In the way they look out for each other and in the way they are connecting to each other, not only because they are mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, they're like friends. So I just think that the discourse is so rich, and in the late imperial period, especially from the 16th and 17th century onwards, there's a lot of writings about it, glorifying how this is the most interesting relationship, that this is a relationship that make other relationships work.
Yes, and that
Yu said that, I think, yeah.
if you're lucky enough, husband and wife will be friend to friend. If you're lucky enough, ruler and subject will be friend to friend. If you're lucky enough.
And also remonstrance, think of the idea of remonstrance, someone who's less powerful being able to tell someone more powerful, you have to correct course. And the basis of that is some sort of friendship. That's what Xunzi said, the highest are those who can treat, is to treat someone of lower power as a teacher, but next to that is to treat someone of lower power as a friend. they're of course much lower gradations. But
Yes, and actually at the Han court, these things are institutionalized. The emperor does not require his teachers to bow to him, nor does he require some of the other high officials who have been chosen to be his helpmate.
Isn't this a rather fine line?
Mhm.
Because as Sima Chen found out to his misfortune, you go one step too far and you are castrated.
Yes, but of course he had a famously autocratic emperor who is
Yeah, that's true.
condemned throughout history for being one of the worst emperors, though an incredibly powerful.
You mean Wu?
Wu Di.
Wu Di.
Yeah, absolutely. Hans.
This is a question first for Professor Stuurman, and then I think secondarily for Professor Lee as well. I hear Professor Stuurman constantly bracketing together humanity and equality. And it seems to me there is a third missing in between concept there, and it's the concept of justice. To recognize somebody as a human being means to recognize them as a moral subject. That means somebody to whom I have relations of justice and injustice potentially. Justice, the sense of justice may, of course, involve a belief in equality, but it doesn't necessarily. Aristotle says famously, justice is indeed a kind of equality, but only for those who are equal.
Yeah.
Right? So it seems to me that when I look at the Chinese tradition, when I read Confucius, for instance, what I see there is this bracketing of humanity and justice. I think the relation to equality is a very indirect one.
I agree. I fully agree. Because in my book, I say common humanity is the sense that we are all, we share something, we share many things. But you have thin versions of common humanity coupled to strong versions of inequality. Let me say, the invention of racial classification. You see that Buffon, for instance, the French naturalist, 18th century, he says that all human beings come from the same ancestors. In that sense, they're equal. And race is an environmentally explained secondary concept. It is not the essence of humanity. But when he comes to the description of the races, stark inequality in the same text. So there is a weak version of common humanity and a strong version of inequality that is transmissible through the generations. And justice is, in my opinion, something entirely different, because justice is a means to govern a society. And justice can come in very different, because in a feudal society, justice means that it's about the inequality of people. Justice is that the vassal obeys the lord, that the bondsman is bound to the soil. That's feudal justice. And what you are talking about is modern justice, and that is, for me, linked to modern equality. And even there, you must ask, when people say that all people are free and equal. For instance, the first article of the famous Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, beginning in first year French Revolution. What does it say? It says all men are born and remain free and equal. Well, so far so good. But what about women? The word women doesn't figure in the whole declaration. It is complete silence. Now, and the gut feelings and intuitions of most Frenchmen at that time, and also most French women, was that there was a basic natural inequality between the sexes. By saying nothing, and the rest was silence. So in that sense, it becomes, that sort of right can become the right of women when some women stand up and say, like Mary Wollstonecraft did at that time, and many others, there were droves of women who protested to the National Assembly that they want to be citizens too. But the question of women's citizenship was tabled by some deputies, but never made it to a plenary session. The rest was silence. So justice can mean very different things to different people. And the different kind of justice, because Christian justice is not that you have rights, it is that you believe in the justice of God. The famous opening the famous experience-changing moment for Martin Luther was that in Justitia tua libera me can be meant the punishing God, but it can also mean that giving yourself to God, then you become in the justice of God, and then you are a Christian, and then you may deserve the eternal life. Not everybody, of course, but you may.
Yes, did you still have a question?
Well, actually, I want to make a comment on what you said. Your question about lineage is kind of not a past time, but I just say it very briefly. There is a very interesting kind of parallel to this lineage story in China, in Greece. You know, when in China, there was this story about how Xiongnu was descended from Yellow Emperor and so on. There's something really similar in Herodotus, there where he said the Persians, you know, kind of the arch enemy of the Greeks, were somehow descended from Perseus, who was married to Andromeda, like all the figures in the Greek mythology. And eventually they became Persians, so that ultimately kind of Greeks and Persians actually shared one ancestry. It's a very minor point. I want to say this. So
Yeah, Katerina?
Thank you. Yeah, along the lines coming back of rights and justice, I cannot help but be reminded of a lot of Hannah Arendt's essays on not just equality, but in particular that equality means nothing unless it means equality in distinctness, in uniqueness, in diversity. And that is, of course, something that ultimately is based on the right to have rights. So this was sort of a little bit along the perspective of Professor Stuurman. I take it that it's not enough just to have justice. We need to somehow bring in a different a principle of humanity that really can we could say guarantee that each person in their uniqueness is also being taken care of, and not just that person within the people. So that's basically the line I wanted to take.
Yeah, but Hannah Arendt discussion is in terms of in the interwar years that there were an increasing amount of stateless people, and stateless people have by definition no rights in our regime. So the right to have rights is saying that there must not be stateless people, and it pertains to our situation nowadays, because nowadays also there are more and more stateless people.
Yeah, but her concept of equality, of course, was based on an ancient account. Her genealogical account begins with Aristotle's Polis, and she develops this rich concept of equality by basically going through history and adding. And the last edition is exactly in terms of the fate of the refugees in our world, sadly very, en courant with Ukraine and what's going on there.
But one short remark, and this, that I'm not with Hannah Arendt, because we live in a world that can no longer be equated to a face-to-face situation with the Greek polis. The Greek model of political action and political participation does not fit in the modern world.
She doesn't think that. It's very easy to misunderstand a genealogical account. It begins to build a rich concept. She's the first who would say, of course, we should never take, the Greek polis as a model to go back to. On the contrary, that's where she begins her critical account.
Going back again to this idea of commonality and difference, one of the interesting lenses that keeps popping into my mind as something worth considering in this yes, is that of religious conversion, and especially as it's implemented through the translation of texts from one language into another. And I was wondering if anybody on the panel would like to talk about, for example, when one is either being converted or one is actually attempting to convert another people, to what extent in the Chinese case is that done on the basis of understanding that there's a basic commonality that is trying to be accessed through this act of conversion? Or is it on the basis of extreme difference that somehow has to be erased? And what I'm particularly thinking about is in the case of the Jesuits' translations of the Bible, the extent to which they argued, and I think I'm not 100% sure about this, but my understanding is that they argued that, in fact, the Chinese are actually already Christian, and it's just a matter of bringing out the correct terminology, slightly changing the wording of the Confucian text to show that, in fact, they're Christian. And so it's just an interesting thing to me, because in order for conversion presupposes that you're crossing a line to go from difference to sameness. And the underlying attitudes through which these things are achieved, I think, would be an interesting way to consider the questions of commonality and difference.
I guess I would start by saying, and perhaps it was because I was trained by Jesuits, I wouldn't say that they are saying the Chinese are already Christian. I think what they're saying is that there are pre-pagan precursors who are one step away from the possibility of realizing a full conversion. So I would see that quite differently than you would from the theological point of view, but I'm not an expert in this either. Yeah, you probably.
Neither am I, but that does not stop me from making noise. I have some unrelated thoughts. I just want to share it all with you. So Matteo Ricci said that you could worship ancestors, you could worship Confucius, you could, there are a few things you could do it that is not in conflict with Catholic doctrines, right? And then a few popes later, they said, no, this really would not do, and then the whole thing shut down. So what was he trying to do? So you could say that what he was proposing was not authentic, was against Catholic teachings, was misunderstanding of Confucianism, but he was proposing a way of common ground, right? And
well, he was proposing that the ancestors should be conceived of as intermediaries, for example, like the saints. The analogies were there for him to propose this.
So,
yeah.
but I mean, whether you, no matter how you judge his inventions or his interventions, what he achieved was quite remarkable, because he had all these literati exchanging poems with him, praising his learning and then learning from him. So that, I think that was something to be happy about. And maybe all this is a mistake of translation, but nevertheless, it was all good. And the second thing is, in the Ming Dynasty, they have a Si Guan, they have the ministry for the 4 barbarians. And when the Manchus came in the middle of the 17th century, they didn't like that terminology very much. They changed it to Si Yi Guan, the 4 translations, the 4 ministries of translation. So what does that mean? So it means that they don't want, of course, they don't want any mention of Yi or barbarians, because they came as a non-Han group, but they are also saying that, yes, but it's all a matter of translation. We can, that we in fact were more Chinese than you, which eventually was what the Chinese accepted too, right? That these were the real whatever holders of mandates and so on. So yeah, so I'll shut up. So I just think translations are really interesting.
Yeah, so I think of Dante and having a pagan guide through the theological realms. I think that's very much allowable in in places you were talking about where traditions are confident enough that they never think quite about the tradition. That's not the dividing line. You're in or out.
Yeah, but I think about the classical mythology as in the early modern period in Europe as a sort of second book of scriptures. So they are not so true as Jesus Christ and God, of course, but they are true in another way. And for instance, in feminist documents from the entire early modern period are these classical examples so relevant because there are many goddesses in it. And in Roman Catholicism, you have only Mary, and you have female saints, but these goddesses are very powerful. So they quote these passages from them as if it is self-evident that quotation was an argument. That for the Bible also, quoting the Bible is not an exercise of your learnedness, it is an argument. And these texts were also arguments.
Yeah. Yes, another question?
Thank you so much. I want to go read and think more about this. I'm gonna. It's an unformed question I'm about to ask, and I want to go to this question of equality, but from a different angle. I've been very perplexed lately by the expression to be equal to oneself, or to be equal to yourself, and what does that exactly mean? What type of equality is that? So I understand it partially, and I don't want to reduce it to this, where I am not tautologically identical. I'm not an X equals X, but there's something other within me that is in the process of becoming or that must become. And so my question relates to within the periods you work in, is there this notion of what it means to become equal to oneself? How might that then make me more of a rich, committed, engaged person in an egalitarian society or culture? And where does a friend help me or criticize me so that I become equal to myself, whatever that means?
I have to
I
say,
see your,
I've
did I not
never
make
heard
sense?
this. I've
You
never
seem
heard
perplexed.
this expression, so I'm at a loss.
Oh, it
But-
exists in English, doesn't it?
I think the closest,
I'm never equal to myself.
not
'cause there are
really.
too many. No,
But-
have you not heard
but-
this? Is this not
but-
an American expression?
I think there's something we were talking about earlier, which means to become your fully developed self. So in Chinese, you are, of course, a person at birth, but you're a person who is immature. And so a lot of Chinese writing is about how you might become what I would say is the best version possible of yourself. I've never heard equal to oneself. So I think there's quite a bit of writing about that. In fact, it's a major preoccupation of most political thinkers in China, and later on, of course, Taoists and Buddhists. But it's in terms of becoming the best, since we're all equal in humanity, but different in every other respect, including the parents we have and the experiences we've acquired as we go through life. We are shaped by those experiences. And then, so what would be the best version of the person you can be?
And that would be within the text you're talking about. It would be a kind of more universal, that the best that each of us can be will be common to all of us, or?
Yes
Well,
and no,
I mean,
also distinct.
Yeah, I think
So
that,
I mean, sure, it varies within text and everything.
absolutely. I mean,
But also, I think, and Trenton Wilson, a student of mine, worked a lot on this. The paradigm is that if you are the best version of yourself, you are far more tolerant and generous to other people who are working on their becoming the best versions of themselves. That's part of what it would take. So for you to say, I'm thinking of a line in one of the thinkers that someone has done something pretty horrible and you're seeing, and you don't begin to lambaste them, you begin to say, where has this gone wrong and how can I improve the way I am to improve the situation in which we're both involved. So they're very complex discussions about that. But I turn it over.
So I think that's in the word you put, to be the best version of yourself. There's a lot of writings on that, and different people come to it from different directions. I think it's actually really strong in what is called Neo-Confucianism,
And earlier.
and in much earlier thought as well. And friendship has a lot to do with it, because one of the sayings in the Analects is that you do not take as friends people who are not as good as you. And it doesn't, it sounds kind of bad, but what he means is that befriend those who can morally transform you, who are morally better than you. And so this interest in moral transformation is, I would say, is of all types of relationships strongest in the discourse on friendship.
Yeah. And so you identify a friend as someone who's in a common search with you to become a better human being. And difference will remain, and difference is celebrated, because the analogy is to music. You need many notes and often many instruments to make beautiful music. So the difference remains and is celebrated as something that can contribute to the common humanity.
and of course, some of the people that you're supposed to look towards to improve yourself are no longer alive.
Yes.
Which makes it even more complicated, the whole notion of community and the models that you're supposed to look toward.
Yeah.
That's why monks talk about 上有古人, that you have to be friends with the ancients, right? It's because of that.
Yeah. Because
A moral.
but I don't think, unlike Kant and post-Kantian, moral and pragmatic go together. The search is for something that is not strictly moral, but is how to live a life in community. And so that requires some pragmatic ability here, as far as I can tell, as one who lacks in many, both moral and pragmatic. But they have to go in tandem, or the whole thing will collapse. I think that's why Bernard Williams, one of the greatest philosophers in the 20th century, said, in many ways, the Greeks, despite the inferiority of women, despite their theories of slavery, were in better shape than we are, because they are not privileging morality above pragmatics. These things have to be developed together. Absolutely.
I just want to, I don't have an answer, but I'm really interested in this question of justice. I've been thinking about it for a while, that whether we actually do have a problem. I mean, the Chinese, that is, that whether we have this sheep problem because of this, this line in Confucius, someone asked him, so in my part of town, people are really fair, and that if if the father steals a ship, the son will report on him. And Confucius said that, well, in my part of town, things don't work that way. That if the father conceals the truth on behalf of the son, and the son conceals the truth on behalf of the father, there is justice in it. 父为子隐，子为父隐，只在其中矣, right? So I always thought, what does that mean that we really have a justice problem? Because when this anecdote is taken up in other writings, like in Han Fei's, in this quote unquote legalist writings, that Han Fei's or whoever it is does not, is really not interested in the question of justice, but he thinks that it's really bad for the state. Because if the family starts covering up for each other, they're not serving the state anymore. So does it mean that nobody is really interested in justice, that they are really thinking about the interests of the kinship versus the interests of the states? This is how this problem is debated, right?
I think it's more complicated than that.
Yes, please.
Okay. First of all, I think the problem with justice is no one has ever been able to agree on even basic
Nobody
notions.
ever agrees with equality either.
Well,
It's the same
but
issue,
if we say qualified equality and then we do a diagnostic of in this society what equality is available, I think that's quite a different problem. But I began reading these early texts, and they're still working out the early empires. And it's always said about early China, they don't have a system of, they don't have a notion of justice. No, they talk about it all the time. And they use multiple words for it. They don't have one word, but gong is used all the time to mean in the common interest, not selfish interest. This is what is needed so that we can have an order to which we can all commit. I think our problem these days is we think of justice as legal, only as what is owed to a given person legally because of the Anglo-American tradition where that's the primary problem. But I think they thought of this in terms of resonance as a cosmic issue and a socio-political issue. What is required for the good of the group? I don't know what other notion of justice we could really come forward to. So that is acknowledging we're in this together. We have a common humanity. And I was having coffee with Luke this morning, and on the wall was a quote from Toni Morrison. And the quote was, "The function of freedom is to ensure freedom for others." So not liberty or freedom for ourselves at the expense of others.
That's how I feel about the Second Amendment. I should have the freedom to not have other people have guns. Right?
Yes, yes, I feel the same way.
So if I may continue this for a moment, it seems to me, as the way I read Confucius is to say, to recognize somebody's humanity means to be able to establish proper ritual relationships with that person. But these are necessarily differentiated and potentially, of course, unequal relationships. So that this bond between humanity and equality is much looser in this context. That's what's the point I was making with respect to.
Okay, so for me, the bottom line
in
is
the Confucian
Confucius is 12a2. Treat each person as a dignitary. That's it. That's the end of quote. Then he goes on. So a lot of ritual is about, and I think Herb Fingerette pointed this out. Have recent ritual theories in China that a lot of ritual that we've assumed is only about establishing hierarchies goes to elaborate lengths to end up, we are equal. We are now talking to each other, despite the hierarchical socio-political statuses. Yeah, an expert on ritual. Yeah.
I also wonder if hierarchy is more problematic to us than it was to them. And so you said that this is a sort of looser bond, but there's people who argue that it's actually a much tighter one. I think I was reading Kong Yingda's commentary on the Lineage, where he says that when you treat someone with ritual propriety, even though you're in different points of the hierarchy, you eliminate the distance between you and that other person.
Yeah.
That you get rid of the distance and the barriers. So even though you're differentiating, even though one person's higher, the other's lower, the real goal is to be able to tolerate that difference without creating unnecessary distance. Now you could argue, well, why it does that, and that whether there's something baked into the concept of ritual in early China, that whether it's you know, the concept of humility and being other-centric is so baked into it that you're inadvertently doing this kind of anthropological turn of seeing it from the other person's perspective, or just that you're co-participants in creating this order, that it's not yet calcified. But there's part of me that wonders if there was something qualitatively different about hierarchy in these eras that it's hard for us to see sometimes.
Well, there's
Do
not
you
just
mean
one
that-
hierarchy. There are 11 or 12 in the Han period. Go
Yes,
ahead.
yes.
And they cross-cut.
Might it help to distinguish between types of hierarchy?
Yes.
Some types of hierarchy are humiliating for the person who is the underdog. But sometimes we accept, for instance, the hierarchy between teacher and student because the teacher can say something and the student can profit it. But we don't accept that as the student asks a question, it was in the old times, students could not ask questions in public lectures of professors. But nowadays we would say that is unnecessary and humiliating to the student. So that sort of differences, because you have, just as with equality, you have strong concepts of equality and weak concept, and you have also strong and weak concept of justice. And all of that is negotiated on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Because in Italy, it says, it stands in all halls of justice, la legge è uguale per tutti. We know about Italy that it not always is that way. I put it softly. And there is a distance between what it says in the halls of justice and what is happening in those very halls. And that difference creates a tension. And I think that sort of tensions happen in every society, because the text that talks Confucius can be seen as a promise. If we behave that way, then we will all better people. But it can also be read more hierarchically.
Yes,
So there is a
in
stretch
Han
in all these
period,
kinds of text.
in Han period, in theory, everyone is equal before the law. And there are statements by people in the court. I'm sorry, we have to set aside what you want to have happen, because that would mean that you are higher than the law. And so we see that in anecdote after anecdote where the emperor, and then if the emperor overrides this, he goes down in history as a bad emperor. I think we don't realize how strongly Han Wudi is condemned. He's said to be like the usurper Wanmang. He had no consideration for any social order. And he was out of control, as we know people in high places can be. Yeah.
No examples needed.
Yes. Any other questions? We have a bit of time. Yes, Teo.
Thank you. I was wondering, Professor Stuurman, I heard you talking about assimilation versus integration, and how for assimilation, migrants are asked to sort of leave their weird religion at the door. And what I wanted to, well, I guess my question is, when they leave their weird religion at the door, are they being asked to adopt some kind of liberal secularism, or is that just a euphemism for another religion, Protestantism?
It is a bit more complicated than that, because when immigrants come to a country which has a different religion or different secularist culture, they have to adapt, because they look for jobs. And I've had many discussions in Holland about the famous Islamic headscarf. And there are principal arguments that the state is not in charge of what people have on their heads. But there's also a pragmatic argument. It hinders you for getting the job you want to get. That is a pragmatic argument. And in practice, the policy of states towards everybody, and especially towards newcomers and migrants, is a mix of three possibilities. As integration is we accept you as you are on the condition that you be a useful person in society, look for work, respect the laws, etc. For the rest, it's all yours. Then you have assimilation, that is we want you in, but on the condition that you go as far as you can towards being one of us. And there must be a new we that includes you. And unfortunately, the we that should get for the migrants is also stronger enforced than the we who are already we, who are already equal. They are the norm, and they push the others or pull them in their direction. But there's also a third possibility, that is exclusion. We accept you as denizens and as workers, but not as equal human beings like we are. And the mixture is continually changing, because in modern liberal democratic states, of course, you have their national states. Nationalism enforce everywhere a measure of homogeneity, to begin with language, but it goes much further than that. Right? But these states are also liberal democratic states and have to award their people a sort of freedom to choose their own way of life and equality to choose their own way of life. And these states have to strike a balance between these two aspects of being a citizen or being a denizen of a country. So there's a continual going on, a push and pull here. There is no absolute norm. It is in politics, there are no absolute norms. In law, there can be, but politics is always, well, look at the United States. The law and the judges are far more important in US politics than in most European countries. But the nomination.
And far more chaotically ruling.
And the appointments of judges are far more politicized than in Europe.
Yes, I would agree.
So there is it is a balance that's continually stricken and restricken. There is no, politics cannot stand still. I cannot say it better.
I was also wondering if you could give some more examples of that weak common humanity and strong inequality you were talking about earlier.
Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Weak common humanity.
No, yeah. Let us talk about feudal Christian societies. There is a common humanity there. We're all children of God. We're all created in God's image, etc., etc. But for the rest, these societies are based on stark regimes of inequality. And it goes even so far that when the Spanish came to America, they were the only colonizers who defined the Native Americans as subjects of the King of Spain and tried to convert them to Roman Catholicism. The Protestants were much less keen to convert these people to Protestantism, because that would mean that they would be Protestant Christian individuals, and with that goes a certain idea of autonomy. Other Protestants, of course, said, owning another human being is against God's law, because you are using a being that God created in his own image as an instrument. You cannot do that.
Yeah, I have a kind of a question following up on Professor Stuurman. You said you said this thing about in historical reality we do not find equality, but we find a critique against inequality, right? And sociologists would also tell us that in society we don't find justice, but we find injustice. Injustice precedes justice. So if we link that back to kind of classic Chinese thought, I would be curious to hear what is the status of Yuan in this discussion? Is Yuan part of discussing what humanity is or not in the classics. I'm
You
talking
mean Yuan as the
Yuan Wang.
dynasty?
No,
or-
Yuan Wang, the Yuan.
Yuan Wang.
So
okay.
is that part of kind of, I speak from a place of ignorance, but does this figure into discussions of what it is to be human?
Gen like humanity.
Mhm. A resentment, something you will feel resentful of, right? Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to jump in here, but Nick and I were reading a text about what is the ideal commandant of justice. So he's the justice minister, and he is the top person. And it's comparing two justices, and they are both believed to be absolutely fair to everyone. But the superior judge is the judge who is able to communicate to everyone, including the criminal and his family, why his sentence is just. So that the criminal maybe going to execution and his family say, yes, that's the only thing to be done. I think of that, on the one hand, you go, I don't believe any criminal in a criminal's family is going, okay, this is just and it must be done. And yet it says something about there is no perfect justice without the ability to communicate something important about what justice might be in individual cases. So I found that very compelling to think about.
But then would you agree that yuan is, at least in the early period, it's more used in those judicial type situations? I mean, there isn't any.
I think of the Analects of Confucius. Yuan is full, and the Analects is full of Confucius's resentment. There is no justice in the world. No one will hire him. He is a failure.
Right.
And I think actually it's one reason the Analects became so popular, because I think people identified there is no justice. You know, I deserve something more than I've gotten. So the nobility of failure model, I think, is a very compelling one when one is reviewing.
I would just say that that's more Sima Qian's version of Kongzi, right, of Confucius, the idea of yuan.
Well, it's shot through the Analects, but of course the Analects is probably a Han Dynasty text. So
I don't know about that. I mean, although that's the prevailing wisdom, but I'm not, you know, I don't have any wisdom on that score. I would just say that yuan is really important in Sima Qian. You can do a word search and find many instances of it, right? When he said about in the Wu Zizhi chapter, right? Yuan du zhi ren shen zai. What sort of thing would resentment drive a person to do? The sense that there is no justice. Or in Wai-yee, the chapter on Wai-yee basically is an extended argument with Confucius, because Confucius said Wai-yee is 求人得人和愿. He seeks yuan and he gets it. So he should have a kind of equanimity in the fulfillment of his virtue. So why should he be resentful? And then Sima Qian then goes on to build a case and said that no, there's a yuan. Don't you see that song that he leaves behind, and so on. So in other words, this yuan becomes, it's not just ruminations on justice. It becomes a kind of almost a kind of engine to engage with history, because then he is the one who's going to right these wrongs by writing about all these people and all these events, right? And but yuan also conveys so much empathetic identification almost with all these characters who suffer injustice. So the word is very frightened, I think, in Sima Qian. So I you know, Michael is right, of course. So in the Analects, Confucius also talked about that maybe heaven is abandoning him and all that, but that I would say that message is heightened in Sima Qian in his version of Confucius is the idea that how do I reveal myself to posterity, that or the way Yan Hui said it's fine that nobody understands that your way doesn't work out, 不行, or how Jian Fu is because your way does not work out, that you reveal your greatness. That is because you and the times do not connect. That's where you show your greatness. So this idea of
and that you continue to persist.
right.
Though,
And Sima Qian, either he invents that line or it comes from somewhere because it has no other source, no other source. So
Well,
this
you
is kind of
get-
non-answer, but
you're getting at the primary discussion in Sima Qian about why is history important? Why is history a mirror? It's because of the empathetic, it's got nothing to do with social scientific objectivity. It's to bring people alive because you empathize with their situation and you see it quite clearly what was possible and not possible. And you can be a noble failure. So conventional success is not what's being celebrated. Yeah.
May I just add one word to this question and the discussion? That is the word of poetic justice, which plays such an important role in Chinese writings. So Yuan, 窦娥冤 one of the, I think you are talking about that yuan, right? So
no, it's the other yuan.
Yuan resentment.
Huh?
怨恨的怨.
Oh yeah, okay. So
Okay,
I thought you were talking about that, like kind of the rectification of injustice through poetic writing.
That is also true.
So-
And so that's also true. That
So that justice is somehow established through poetry, but now I'm confusing these two words, but I think it kind of it's still the same. Yeah.
yeah, because they're not unrelated. Yeah.
But I'm getting confused because you seem to be saying two things, that justice in the here and now, and if one doesn't get that, you can get justice in the future.
Yes, and I think that
By the respect of later ages. You yourself don't live to see that, but the hope for that is somewhere important. Is that what you mean?
Yes, I think so. I mean, many people speak about writing for the Ho Dai, the future generations. They have given up on justice in their own lives and are writing for a future, someone who may understand them in the future, who has more power to put this into effect.
And has that to do with a sort of sense of immortality that people then get?
Well, I think many people, and perhaps I'm overly influenced by Xunzi, but Xunzi doesn't think there's any immortality. But you can pass on, one of the 5 blessings is to pass on a good reputation. And one way you pass on a good reputation, or the 2 primary ways, would be to engage productively on behalf of others in office, whether you're emperor or official. And the other way would be to leave your writings when you cannot engage productively, because that avenue has been closed to you. Now, a dear Buddhist friend of mine said, "Oh, Michael, that's the last illusion, to think anybody will care once you're dead." But anyway, I think many of us do continue to write books because we think maybe someone will read this and find it of use.
Well, that is of course a very ancient Greek.
Absolutely.
We think of Achilles and the question of fame,
Mhm.
being put to him what's more important. you are this, that you can become a great king during your lifetime and, have all the success on earth, or that, you have a significant and meaningful life. Actually, that was a way to be immortalized if you and your fate and your deed could survive in the story, in the mythos, in the, what was then being related in history.
Yeah, well, you
So-
brought up Hannah Arendt. and
Yes,
she calls
she's a-
this Homeric equality.
Exactly. It's of course, she
yeah.
has a lot to say on everything. By the way, the most beautiful things on friendship. The way you constructed it is actually pretty much in how she spells it out in, in her one small genealogical account, beginning with Aristotle and Aristotle's notion of friendship, which also, the highest friendship was, of course, the political friendship, which was always about the common thing that had been valued and needed to be achieved.
Right. Needed to be transmitted.
Yes, absolutely.
Marcus Aurelius would say you're grasping on to the future gossip of others.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yes, I'm sure he would. I've never been a Stoic. I think Stoics are also romantics, and it's never appealed to me. I'm so capable of being in control and isolated. But yes, I'm sure he would.
But my question is actually, Professor Stuurman, earlier when you were talking about L'Esprit de l'Homme by Montesquieu, and you said there was a line in his notes that went unpublished that was very radical, and I did not quite hear it, and the person sitting next to me didn't either, although they left.
Well, in the notes, it says first that slavery is against natural law, and then comes this explosive sentence: the war waged by Spartacus, the leader of the slave revolution, slave insurrection in the Roman Empire, was the most just war in human history. And that's the sentence that didn't make it to the published text.
Thank you.